Hey there, folks. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at the End of History podcast and jbshreve.com, where we help believers make sense of the chaotic world around them through intelligent, faith-based perspectives on our times and the history that helped shape those times. Today, we're continuing our podcast series, The Empire, a 250-year American story. We are on episode 21 of this deep dive into the story of American history, looking in this episode at the massive Western expansion that took shape in the first half of the 19th century. Now, Thomas Jefferson, when the U.S. purchased the Louisiana Purchase there at the beginning of that century, he believed it would take 1,000 years to fully populate that land. Not only did he miss that mark by a long sight, but the U.S. even expanded beyond that and all the way to the Pacific Ocean by the mid-centuries mark. In this episode, we're going to look at how that unfolded. Remember, if you've not already been to theendofhistory.net, you can find all sorts of articles and essays to help supplement these episodes, as well as some great recommended reads from some of the sources that I'll be quoting from in this episode, as well as in all of the other episodes from this series. Check it out today, theendofhistory.net or jbshreve.com. Both of those domains will get you there. Thanks for listening, folks. Let's go ahead and jump in.
This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So ever since the first European settlers set foot on the coastline of the New World, there on the Atlantic coast, the ideas of westward expansion really seemed almost predetermined. Even before the settlements on the Atlantic coast could prove successful, many of the residents in those villages, those towns, they started pressing west into the wilderness, into the mountains. It was that westward movement that really helped spark the conflicts with the Indians that predates the European wars in America. But once those European wars came, the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, even the War of 1812, the movement west always played a role in the causes and the natures of those wars, each one as they came along. By the year 1800, 13 former colonies had become now 16 states. But the country's western boundary remained still a hazy line along the Mississippi River. Beyond that river lay a continent of forests, plains, deserts, mountains, lands mapped only in fragments, lands inhabited by hundreds of Indian nations with their own histories, their own alliances, their own rivalries. To many Americans, that vast interior of the continent was just a mystery. To others, it was a promise. And to a growing number of political leaders, writers, and frontier dreamers, it was also being seen as a destiny. Now, the idea had not been given its famous name yet, manifest destiny. But the sentiment, it was already there. The belief that the United States was meant to expand, to spread its institutions, its people, and its power across the continent. It was a belief rooted in ambition, in optimism, and hunger, and in a sense of national mission that bordered really on the sacred. Jeffersonian republicanism sort of radicalized this vision, right? Not only did Americans have a right to spread westward, they had an obligation. They had a mission from God to spread the ideas of the Enlightenment like freedom and liberty, and surely those ideas would change the hearts, change the minds of all who came in contact with them. Between 1800 and 1850, the United States transformed from a coastal republic into a continental empire at a rate of speed that few could have imagined at the beginning of the century. Jefferson himself thought it would take 1,000 years to settle, to populate the lands of just the Louisiana Purchase. It would end up taking only 2 generations, and the U.S. would even double in geographic size by the mid-century mark. Long before the American empire spread its power across the seas, they took control of the land. They took control of the continent under their own feet. Now, we've already looked at the Louisiana Purchase and the Corps of Discovery that Lewis and Clark led when they set out in the first decade of the 19th century to map these new lands. Lewis and Clark trekked across the mountains, the rivers, the canyons, the forest that would soon become 15 future states and members of the new nation. The Corps of Discovery set out in 1804, and their journey became one of the great epics of American history. They wintered with the Mandan in what is now North Dakota. They crossed the Bitterroot Mountains with the help of the Shoshone. They carved their names into trees, collected specimens. They recorded everything they saw. Prairies teeming with bison, rivers choked with beaver, mountains that seemed to scrape the sky. Stephen Ambrose in his book, the historian Stephen Ambrose in his book, Undaunted Courage, highly recommend. But he tells the story of Lewis and Clark. And at one point, writing about the Corps of Discovery, as they arrived near the midpoint of their journey, Ambrose writes, that evening, the first Americans ever to enter Montana, the first ever to see the Yellowstone, the Milk, the Marias, and the Great Falls, the first Americans ever to kill a grizzly, celebrated their nation's 29th birthday. It was July 4th. Kind of fascinating to imagine being the first Americans to do and see all these things. And that became part of the mythology and the identity of the American spirit after this. It was to be first, to go where no man's gone before. The pioneering spirit began to define what it meant to be an American, who we are and what we're about. Of course, the reality is, Lewis and Clark were not the first men to see all of these things. They were the first Americans. Behind the pioneering spirit is the tragic and very unjust story of the American Indians and what America's pioneering spirit meant for them. Behind the scenes, or behind the nation's great stories, legends, and myths, we're going to get to that part of the story too in a later episode. For now, I think we have to recognize the significance of what Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery accomplished so we can better appreciate the shaping of this American identity that came along with their journey. When they reached the Pacific in 1805, at the end of their journey, they built a small fort and they waited out the winter there. Their return journey in 1806 brought them home as national heroes. Their reports ignited the American imagination. For Americans, now the West was no longer a blank space on the map. It was a place of opportunity, rich, vast, and waiting. And I think that term, the West, is important to consider too. Maybe it's just me, but when I think of the West, I think of cowboys and outlaws. I think of Western movies, all right? I think of Wyoming, New Mexico, Tombstone, Arizona. All of that is part of the West too. Those images and legends and myths are part of the West of the latter half of the 19th century. For the story of the American Empire, the story of the West is really about the lands west of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. The Americans had been pushing on the borders of those lands even before Lewis and Clark. The original frontiersman, in fact, was over 70 years old and a living legend by the time of Lewis and Clark when they returned from their journey. That's Daniel Boone. He was the icon of the American ideal of Western expansion, the pioneer myth, as some historians have come to call it. Born in 1734 in Pennsylvania, Daniel Boone, he grew up on the ragged edge of British settlement, where hunting wasn't a pastime, it was a way of life. By his teens, he was already known as a marksman, slipping through forest with the quiet confidence of someone who understood the wilderness better than most people understood their own towns. His greatest adventures began when he pushed beyond the Alleghenies into the lands few colonists had seen. In 1769, he blazed the wilderness road through the Cumberland Gap, carved a passage into Kentucky that thousands of settlers would later follow to the west. That journey alone, it was a saga. Months of isolation, near starvation, and constant threat from Shawnee warriors who viewed Boone as an intruder on their hunting ground. He was eventually captured, more than once in fact. He escaped more than once and kept returning, driven by a belief that the frontier was meant to be crossed. Boone's exploits at Boonesboro became the stuff of legend. During the 1778 siege, he led daring sorties, negotiated under fire, and even survived being adopted into a Shawnee family after a long captivity. His escape, running nearly 160 miles in 4 days. Think about that. That's 40 miles a day. That's ultra running for 4 days in a row. And think about he doesn't have fuel packets with him, okay? Running 160 miles in 4 days to warn the settlement. It cemented his reputation as a man really of almost superhuman endurance. Boone was a surveyor, a pathfinder. He was a symbol of the American urge to push westward. He guided families through mountain passes, mapped rivers and valleys. He kept moving along after others settled down. Even in old age, he drifted toward Missouri, still chasing open land and quiet forests. His adventures obviously weren't polished or romantic in the moment. They were hard. They were dangerous. They were tragic, often. But together, they shaped the mythology of the American frontier and turned Daniel Boone into one of the country's first folk heroes. So by the early 19th century, Boone was living in Missouri, then part of the Spanish territory. He was old, but his legend was young. Newspapers and storytellers, they turned him into a mythic figure, the man who carved civilization out of wilderness, the embodiment of rugged American individualism. As is usually the case, Boone's real life is a bit more complicated. He's got a lot of debts, losses, constant movement, but his myth did matter. It shaped how Americans viewed the West, how they imagined the West at least, a place where ordinary men like Daniel Boone could become heroes like Daniel Boone, where the land rewarded courage and punished weakness. The core of discovery, men like Daniel Boone, they would provide the template for the pioneering spirit and myth that many Americans came to see themselves embodying. But it was the political and military forces that would help clear the way into the Western wilderness for many Americans to embrace those ideals. And Andrew Jackson, the guy we've already looked at, right? He was the man who helped open that path more than anyone else after Thomas Jefferson in the first half of the 19th century. Now, we looked at Jackson in the last episode, his rise to fame at the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. Jackson represented a new generation of the American spirit. Even though he lived through the American Revolution, he wasn't a Virginia aristocrat or even a New England patriot. Jackson grew up in the South, at the edge of what was seen as the wilderness of the West at that point. We touched on this in the last episode, but after his victory in New Orleans, his meteoric rise to national fame gave him credibility, gave him power that few Americans had experienced outside of the founding generation. He used that influence to advance himself and American interests in the West. In 1818, Andrew Jackson invaded Spanish-held Florida. Without explicit authorization also. That's something to keep in mind. He did this without being authorized by the U.S. government. He's pursuing Seminole fighters and runaway slaves. His actions were really aggressive. Arguably, they were illegal, but they were effective. Spain weakened, they were distracted, and so they ceded Florida to the United States in 1819. Florida was not technically West, but it was still considered part of the land of future possibility for Americans to conquer. When Jackson did so, he was opening the door for what many came to see as America's destiny. Jackson's message was clear. American expansion would not be slowed by diplomacy alone. Force was now an option, according to Andrew Jackson, and even often the preferred option. And that, too, would be a template for his successors in the future. By the time of Jackson's presidency in 1828, every president from George Washington to John Quincy Adams had been either from Virginia or New England. They were the understood successors of the founders. Jackson, leveraging his fame in New Orleans and then that he also built in Florida, he changed the nature of the American presidency when he arrived to the White House. He changed expectations for America's leaders. Jackson carried this swagger of a frontier fighter and the reputation of a man who never backed down from a duel or a political enemy. This wasn't George Washington. This is a new breed here. He was a national hero, the tough general who could rally a ragtag force and win against impossible odds, but he was also seen as a political outsider. Many of his supporters believed that the election of 1824 had actually been stolen from him by the trickery of John Quincy Adams and the political establishment at the time. It wasn't true, but the narrative of the political outsider stuck with Americans eager for new opportunities and ready for a new type of leader. In a way, we could say that Andrew Jackson kind of struck the mold for the political outsider that resonates all the way to our modern times in guys like Donald Trump. Truth and facts were not what mattered. The legend of the myth were a lot easier for Americans to take hold of. And in 1820, the legend and myth of Jackson, some of it true, most of it embellished, was very appealing to many Americans. People saw in Andrew Jackson, nicknamed Old Hickory, a self-made American, plain-spoken, uncompromising, unafraid to challenge elites. It was really that image more than any policy, that propelled Andrew Jackson to the White House. Jackson's presence in the White House helped fuel the surge of the American expansion westward. He believed the nation's strength depended on ordinary white settlers gaining access to new lands, new economic opportunity. His political identity was tied to the frontier. Tough, self-made, suspicious of entrenched Eastern elites, and he carried that ethos into national policy. One of Jackson's major contributions to westward expansion came through his economic battles. His veto of the Bank of the United States, the subsequent bank war, shifted federal deposits into state-chartered pet banks. These banks issued abundant credit, which in turn encouraged land purchases across the West. Speculators, farmers, small entrepreneurs, they poured into territories like Arkansas, Michigan, Florida, accelerating the path towards statehood in these areas. Jackson also strengthened the federal government's role in shaping new Western infrastructure. His administration supported surveying, road building, the expansion of postal routes, all of which helped knit frontier communities into the national economy. Steamboat traffic on Western rivers boomed during his presidency. New towns sprang up along the Mississippi and its tributaries. Culturally, Jackson embodied the expanding American spirit. Restless, ambitious, convinced that the nation's future lay across the continent, his presidency helped cement the idea that the West was the proving ground of American democracy and opportunity. The age of Jackson was also a time of major expansion in the West. Some of this was the direct result of Andrew Jackson's efforts. Some of it was simply empowered by him. But this was the age of major advancement under Jackson. In a couple of decades' time, long after the death of Andrew Jackson, Americans would come to understand this westward expansion as their manifest destiny. That was the phrase. The phrase, this idea of manifest destiny, emerged in the 1840s as both an explanation and a justification for America's accelerating westward expansion. The phrase itself was credited to the journalist John L. O'Sullivan. Recently, the historian Alan Taylor has suggested that Jane McManus, who did a lot of ghostwriting for O'Sullivan, was probably the one who actually coined the term. Whoever it was, the idea stuck. The proponents of manifest destiny, they argued that the United States had a manifest destiny to overspread the continent and extend the blessings of liberty and self-government. But the idea really had deeper roots. Since the revolutions, Americans believed their Republican experiment was unique. It was fragile, yet morally charged, and that its success carried implications for the whole world. As population grew and new states formed, expansion seemed not only natural, but necessary to preserve opportunity, avoid the social stratification that was seen in Europe at the time. By the Jacksonian era, this belief fused with a more assertive nationalism. The Louisiana Purchase, the push into Florida, the settlement of the old Northwest all reinforced the sense that the nation's growth was guided not merely by Andrew Jackson, not merely by the government, but by God. Protestant revivalism added a spiritual dimension, framing expansion as part of a divine mission to spread Christianity, to spread civilization. Christianity and democratic institutions were all part of this civilization. At the same time, economic pressures like soil exhaustion in the East, the lure of fertile Western lands, and the rise of commercial agriculture, they gave the ideology practical force. Unspoken, but usually implied by this belief, was the reality that it was God's will for white Americans to displace the Indians of the West. And, by the way, to spread slavery as they did this. Manifest destiny, it shaped foreign policy for America. It encouraged the annexation of Texas, the Oregon boundary dispute, and ultimately the Mexican-American War. In essence, manifest destiny was a story Americans told themselves, that expansion was inevitable. Westward expansion was inevitable. It was righteous. It was central to the nation's identity. It blended ambition, it blended faith, self-interest into this powerful national creed concoction that reshaped the continent. Now, the Oregon Trail was one of the early demonstrations of that manifest destiny. This avenue sat at the beating heart of America's westward expansion, a 2,000-mile corridor that turned a continental vision into lived reality. Beginning in the 1840s, as the idea of manifest destiny really took hold, tens of thousands of families hitched their wagons in Missouri and pointed them toward a horizon they believe held opportunity, independence, and most importantly, land. The United States was young, it was restless and hungry to grow, and the Oregon Trail became the great overland engine driving that ambition. The journey itself was just a crucible, just a horrible ordeal for most people. Immigrants spent 4 to 6 months crossing plains, crossing mountains, deserts even, enduring everything from spring floods to summer dust storms. The Platte River Valley offered the first long stretch of survival, flat, monotonous, deceptively easy, but by the time they reached Fort Laramie, they were already confronting the physical and emotional costs of the trek. Things like cholera haunted the trail. Wagon axles snapped. Oxen collapsed under the strain of what they were pulling. South Pass in the Rockies marked the symbolic midpoint, a gentle rise that made wagon travel possible across the Continental Divide. But beyond it, the trail funneled migrants into the Snake River Plain, where heat and scarcity of grass, treacherous river crossings tested even the hardiest of pioneers. The final push into Oregon, either down the dangerous Columbia River or along the grueling Barlow Road around Mount Hood, was a last reminder that the West demanded resilience. By 1860, nearly 300,000 people had traveled the Oregon Trail. Their arrival transformed the Pacific Northwest. It accelerated U.S. claims to the region and intensified the displacement of Indian nations whose homelands lay along that route. The trail wasn't just a migration path, it was a force. It was a force that reshaped the map, fueled the nation's expressionist identity, and embedded the frontier journey into America's memory. One of the famous, or most famous, or infamous, I guess, of these wagon train parties was that of the Donner Party. The Donner Party's ordeal in the winter of 1846 to 47, it became one of the most haunting symbols of the risk woven into America's westward expansion. Their story, the Donner Party, began like that of thousands of other immigrants. It began with hope. They were drawn by the promise of fertile lands in California, recently pried from Mexico's weakening grip. Families from Illinois and Missouri, they joined a wagon train heading west along that established Oregon Trail. They were part of a really larger group, much larger group of Americans pushing toward the Pacific. They were convinced that opportunity and destiny, like everyone else in the wagon train, lay beyond the Rockies. Well, the Donners and the Reeds, these two families, they made a fateful decision that set them apart. At Fort Bridger, they chose to follow the Hastings Cutoff, an untested shortcut promoted by guidebook writer Lansford Hastings. It promised to shave weeks off the journey. Well, instead, it cost them precious time. That route forced them through the Wasatch Mountains and across the Great Salt Lake Desert, where they lost oxen, they lost wagons, and of course they lost their morale. By the time they rejoined the main trail, they were dangerously behind schedule. As winter storms swept into the Sierra Nevada in late October, the party, the Reeds and the Donners, they became trapped near what's now Donner Lake. Snow piled up to 20 feet. Hunting game disappeared. Supplies ran out. Families built makeshift cabins and tried to survive on boiled hides, on boiled bark and scraps. Rescue parties from California attempted to reach them, but the mountains swallowed nearly every effort. In desperation, some members attempted to cross the mountains on foot. Others even resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. Several years ago, my wife and I did a road trip through this area of the country. We listened to an audiobook called The Best Land Under Heaven by Michael Wallace. We honestly weren't traveling in this part of the country to see the Donner Party area, but it was a particularly fascinating story to listen to as we traveled through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Great book, by the way. Of the 87 people in the Donner Party who entered the Sierra, only 48 survived. The Donner tragedy revealed the brutal underside of the westward dream. While the frontier promised land and reinvention, it also demanded endurance. It demanded luck and hard choices. Their story became a cautionary tale for later immigrants and a stark reminder that the push toward the Pacific, so central to America's identity, was built on both triumph and unimaginable hardship. Adding another layer to the story of America's westward expansion were the mountain men. The mountain men were the first Americans to push deep into the interior West, long before wagon trains carved these ruts across the plains. In the early 1800s, when the fur trade was booming and maps of the Rockies were mostly blank, men like Jedediah Smith and Jim Bridger, They became the scouts, the storytellers, the accidental pathfinders of America's westward expansion. Their lives were harsh, often solitary, shaped by constant negotiation with indigenous nations whose lands they traveled through. Yet their trails, their journals, their survival instincts opened routes that later immigrants would follow by the tens of thousands. Jedediah Smith, he was the most likely among them all in my mind. A deeply religious guy. He was quiet, he was disciplined, but he possessed this fierce curiosity and a talent for reading landscapes. In 1823, after surviving a grizzly bear attack that tore off part of his scalp, nearly his ear, Jedediah Smith, he kept traveling. He was the first American to cross the Sierra Nevadas. He was the first to reach California overland from the east, and one of the earliest really to map the Great Basin. His expeditions, the expeditions of Jedediah Smith, they stitched together vast stretches of the West, revealing passes and river systems that would later guide the Oregon Trail and California Trail. His death in 1831, killed by Comanches on the Santa Fe Trail, only added to his legend as a figure who lived and died on the edge of the known world. Jim Bridger, by contrast, became one of the archetypes of the seasoned mountain man. Tough, humorous, endlessly resourceful, he trapped beaver across the Rockies. He learned multiple Indian languages, married into the Flathead and the Shoshone communities. Bridger's greatest contribution came from his unmatched geographic knowledge. He discovered the Great Salt Lake by following the Bear River, guided immigrants through the rugged canyons of Wyoming. He later operated Fort Bridger, a crucial resupply point on the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails. When settlers needed a safer alternative to the treacherous Snake River route, it was Bridger who pointed them towards South Pass and other navigable corridors. Together, these two guys, or men like these two guys, like Smith and Bridger, they embodied the bridge between wilderness exploration and mass migration. Their paths became the skeleton of America's westward expansion, routes that settlers and soldiers and missionaries and fortune seekers, all of them together, would follow as the United States pushed toward the Pacific. Their stories capture the raw, learn and make it up as you go energy of the early frontier, where survival and curiosity and ambition reshaped the map of the continent. Now, these individuals, these groups, they laid the foundation for America's westward expansion. In the Southwest, the lands we know as Texas today, they set the stage for the next phase of the westward expansion. The story of the Texas Revolution, the birth of the Republic of Texas, sits at the crossroads of American ambition, Mexican nation building, and the broader surge of westward expansion that really defined early 19th century. In the 1820s, Mexico, newly independent from Spain, eager to stabilize its northern frontier, they invited American settlers into this sparsely populated province of Texas. Impresarios like Stephen F. Austin, they brought hundreds of families who established farms along the Brazos, along the Colorado rivers. These settlers pledged loyalty to Mexico, but they brought with them a Protestant faith, a slave-based agricultural economy, and a political culture shaped by U.S. frontier democracy. So tensions simmered right from the start. By the early 1830s, Mexico attempted to reassert control. They started to restrict immigration, enforce customs duties, curb slavery. Settlers resisted. Clashes escalated into open revolt by 1835. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, he was one of the most influential and one of the most polarizing figures in 19th century Mexico. He was born in 1794. He rose through the ranks of the Spanish colonial army. Initially, he actually fought with the Spanish against Mexican independence, but by the time of mass migration of Americans into Texas, he had shifted sides and embraced Mexican independence. And that positioned him as a defender of national Mexican sovereignty. Charismatic, ambitious, deeply political, Santa Anna served as Mexico's president 11 different times. Right? Often, he would sometimes shift between liberal and conservative positions, just depending on the circumstances. This guy was very opportunistic. Santa Anna fancied himself the Napoleon of the West. This was the title, actually, that multiple generals, multiple leaders from Simón Bolívar in South America to George McClellan, leader of the Union Army during the Civil War, they tried to live up to. No one ever quite did, though. But Santa Anna was among those. Santa Anna became famous for his leadership of Mexico during the Texas Revolution, which made him a central figure in the conflict. In 1836, he personally led the Mexican army into Texas. Now, most Americans know him for the Battle of the Alamo. Santa Anna marched north to crush the growing Texas rebellion, a small garrison of roughly 200 defenders. Texans and Tejanos alike took refuge in the old mission in San Antonio, led by figures like William Travis, James Bowie, and the frontiersman Davy Crockett from Tennessee. These defenders, they knew they were hopelessly outnumbered, but they refused to abandon their position. For 13 days, Santa Anna's forces bombarded the Alamo, tightening the noose around the mission. At dawn on March 6, Mexican troops launched a full assault, overrunning the walls after fierce close-quarter fighting. Every defender at the Alamo was killed. It was a military defeat, but the Alamo became a rallying cry. Remember the Alamo. And that fueled Texan resolve and helped propel the revolution to victory at San Jacinto weeks later. Washington, D.C. watched these developments with interest. The politicians there, they're watching what's going on in Texas. Many American leaders believed that Texas naturally belonged within the United States, expanding the orbit of the United States. That's what they needed to do. So while the federal government could not openly encourage rebellion, it quietly supported migration, celebrated the region's potential, and allowed U.S. newspapers and politicians to frame Texas as the next logical step in America's continental growth. Well, this fit neatly within the rising ideology of manifest destiny, which cast the westward expansion as both inevitable and also virtuous. The Texas Revolution produced some of the most enduring frontier legends: the fall of the Alamo, the massacres at Gilead. All these things we can't get into today because we can't make the whole podcast about Texas. But we have the stunning Texas victory even at San Jacinto, where Sam Houston's army captured General Santa Anna and forced him to recognize Texan independence. In 1836, the Republic of Texas was born. A fragile, debt-ridden nation, mind you. This isn't a state for the U.S. right here. It was its own nation that nonetheless symbolized the triumph of American settlers on contested ground. Now, for nearly a decade, Texas sought annexation to the United States. Presidents in Washington hesitated. They feared that war with Mexico it would just make things worse. They weren't sure they could do that just yet. There was also this deepening sectional conflict over slavery that was starting to rise up to the surface. But expansionist pressure mounted. Texas offered millions of acres of cotton land, a strategic Gulf Coast position, and a powerful symbolic victory for this idea of manifest destiny. In 1845, Congress approved annexation, and Texas entered the Union as a slave state. Well, easier said than done, right? Because this now triggered the Mexican-American War. The final push of west for American visions of stretching from sea to shining sea came with this all-out war. The opening decade of the 19th century included a war against British forces in Canada, which Americans believed should belong to them. Well, before the half-century mark now, they would now push against Mexico in the south. James K. Polk, he's the new president now. He entered the White House in 1845 with a clarity of purpose unmatched by most presidents. He was nicknamed Young Hickory, kind of an homage to Andrew Jackson. Polk was a disciplined, work-driven executive who set four major goals for his administration: settle the Oregon boundary, restore the independent treasury, reduce tariffs, and acquire California. He ended up achieving all of them in a single term. He's little remembered by the general public today, but many historians place this guy among one of the most effective presidents ever because he expanded the nation's territory more than any other leader except Thomas Jefferson, of course, with the purchase of the Louisiana Purchase. Well, the road to the Mexican-American War began with that annexation of Texas. Mexico never recognized Texan independence. Santa Anna surrendered, but Mexico, the government itself, didn't recognize Texan independence, and they warned that annexation by the United States of Texas would actually mean war. Polk embraced the risk. He believed the United States had both a strategic and an ideological claim to the West, and he quietly encouraged the idea that America's manifest destiny, it's now being used by the phrase is now being used by the politicians here. Manifest destiny required a continental nation stretching to the Pacific. Well, tensions escalated when President Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to move U.S. troops into the disputed territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. In April 1846, Mexican and American forces clashed, and that gave Polk the justification he needed to ask Congress for a declaration of war. The conflict that followed became a proving ground for a generation of officers who would later dominate the Civil War. Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, George McClellan, all of these guys served in Mexico, learning lessons in logistics and engineering and battlefield command. This was also the first highly polarizing war of America's history, far more so than the War of 1812. Even some of the famous military men who began building their reputation during the Mexican-American War, they felt conflicted about the fight. Ulysses S. Grant, he described it as he's serving in the military, he's fighting in Mexico. He described the war as an evil war, even though he carried nostalgia about the time in that fight for the rest of his life. The famous New England poet, Henry David Thoreau, he wrote his influential essay, Civil Disobedience, after he was imprisoned for refusing to pay taxes that would go to supporting the Mexican-American War. A lot of people in the East believed America and its leaders had carried this idea of manifest destiny too far by this point, and they were very much looked down on. They very much looked down on the moral calculations of President Polk and his Mexican-American War. General Zachary Taylor, he won early victories in northern Mexico. He earned national fame, and the nickname Old Rough and Ready is what they would call him. Really weird nicknames for some of the generals during this time period. But President Polk, wary of Taylor's rising political popularity, he shifted the war's decisive campaign to General Winfield Scott, a brilliant strategist, all right? Scott led an amphibious landing at Veracruz, the first in U.S. history. He marched inland, fighting his way to Mexico City. Most people don't even know that we went to war and fought in Mexico City, that the Americans did. By September 1847, American forces occupied the Mexican capital. Again, most Americans don't even realize that American troops marched all the way to the Mexican capital and even occupied it for a time. The war formally ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, negotiated by the diplomat Nicholas Trist, a grandson-in-law to Thomas Jefferson. The treaty forced Mexico to cede a vast swath of territory, including present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, in exchange for $15 million. Now, ironically, Trist, the guy who negotiated this treaty, he negotiated it after President Polk had ordered him recalled for being too slow. Trist defied the president. He completed the negotiations and he sent the treaty to Washington anyway. Now, President Polk was furious, but Congress approved it, and it recognized that Trist had secured the best terms possible. And so by 1850, thanks in no small part to the Mexican-American War, the North American continent had been reshaped, and less than 100 years after the American Revolution, the seeds of empire were now literally stretching from sea to shining sea at last. Whether the principle of manifest destiny was true or not, it really mattered very little. The facts had been imposed on the ground. Now, all that remained was to fill up those lands with Americans. And almost as if to prove the divine reality behind the ideas of manifest destiny, the lure was set in 1848 with the discovery of gold in California. That discovery of gold in California in 1848 exploded into one of the most dramatic turning points in America's westward expansion. January 24th of that year, 1848, James Marshall, a carpenter working for John Sutter, same guy who helped rescue the Donner Party, he's working along the American River. He spotted flakes of gold in the water. And what began as a quiet attempt to keep the discovery secret quickly became a global story. Once President Polk confirmed the find in his December 1848 message to Congress, Polk's endorsement of the reality, it gave the news national legitimacy, and it ignited a mass migration unlike anything the young nation had seen to this point in history. Within months, tens of thousands of Americans, farmers, clerks, laborers, restless young men, they abandoned their homes and they headed west. Some traveled overland, along the Oregon and California trails. They endured the same grueling journey that earlier pioneers had faced. Others sailed south around Cape Horn, across the disease-ridden Isthmus of Panama. By the end of 1849, nearly 90,000 people had poured into California, earning the nickname 49ers. And over the next few years, the population surged into the hundreds of thousands. This migration transformed the West. Mining camps became towns. Towns became cities. San Francisco, it exploded from this sleepy village into a booming port almost overnight. The gold rush accelerated the displacement of Indian tribes and nations. It intensified demand for infrastructure, forced the federal government to extend law and order and political authority into the Pacific region far sooner than expected. And most importantly, the gold rush completed the continental vision that had driven American expansion for decades. It pulled the nation's center of gravity westward. It tied California to the Union and helped turn the Pacific coast into a vital part of the American economy. In the story of Manifest Destiny, gold was the spark that drew the world to the far edge of the continent and reshaped the United States forever. Kind of crazy to see how fast America grew in the 50 years of the 19th century, the first 50 years of the 19th century, and it was not all dominated by the military or even the government. They often followed in after the missionaries and after the trappers, after the settlers, but the government and the military, they seldom led the way. In retrospect, it could all be seen as inevitable in retrospect, but it really wasn't at the time. The people who led the journey west, those who survived, they did so by overcoming these enormous obstacles, overcoming enormous odds. And it really did seem at times like God was setting all this up. If I'm being honest, the idea of Manifest Destiny would have been an easy idea to take hold of at the time. Now, of course, we're telling about the winning side of Manifest Destiny. There was another side. I haven't forgotten that side of the story, the side of the slaves, the side of the American Indians who were often sacrificed for this advance westward. We're going to get to those stories. I didn't want to include them as just a subplot in this episode. Later, we're going to look at those who were not the winners of history, those who write the history books. The winners of history write the history books, and they like to forget, or at least minimize, those who got run over in the process. But before we do that, we need to look at a couple of other fast-changing dynamics within American society during the first half of the 19th century. In the next episode, I think it's going to be one episode, it might be two, but in the next episode or episodes, we're going to turn our attention to the Industrial Revolution and the Second Great Awakening. That's coming soon here on the podcast. I'm J.B. Shreve, and this is The End of History, where we help believers make sense of the chaotic world we live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives on current events and the historical seeds that made those current events. We'll be back next week with our next episode in this series, The Empire, a 250-year American story.